Hello, beautiful community. Just a quick Sunday reconnect where we'll just briefly touch on, with a word or two, on the barbaric bombings of historic Odessa. And then we'll say a bit about that 12-minute presentation by Putin in which he talked about Poland annexing bits of Ukraine, and that was followed by his meeting with Lukashenko, where they continued playing out some kind of game of instilling fear about the instability of the Belarusian border with Poland and Lithuania. And at the end, I'll just say a sentence or two, I think, because I want to, about how we live with disagreement. Let me just say something personal about Odessa. I mean, I'm not surprised, and nor do I think something qualitatively different is happening, I'm afraid to say. We have been saying for a long time that what Putin does is a matter of convenience, necessity, and capacity. And as long as these things get ticks, in principle, I don't think he has a big stumbling block about turning not just Odessa but Kiev into Aleppo. And I think it's still a product of a kind of pre-22 Feb 2022 world in which we have this instinct. Oh gosh, I thought he wouldn't do that. And we have to realize how much Putin is in deep water, how locked in he is into this project, even though, as we'll say in a moment, for now, he doesn't want a globalization, internationalization, big escalation of it, but he may want that later. And how central this is to his perceptions of regime security, and how much he is even an existential threat to us at a nuclear level, perhaps not as much as he is said to be by the people who are ventilating nuclear risk excessively, but is more of a nuclear risk than is the preponderance of opinion in our kind of bubble. And what that means is that his relationship with us, the idea of a strategic nuclear exchange, is, of course, the relationship of someone who absolutely does not want that, that would do a lot to avoid it, but he's not as avoidant of it as Scholz or Macron, but also not as avoidant of it as Khrushchev or Brezhnev. There's a different psychology there, and we discussed that in some ways that are kind of continuous with Masha Gessin's thoughts on this in a video on the main channel, and it's the least watched video of whatever it is, the last 2025. It's got about 100,000 views because algorithmically saying that Putin is a nuclear danger is not popular. But it's an important point to press because in the West, there is still a prejudice which says, well, something after Putin might be worse. And I think that's a legitimate concern, but I think that it's a concern that is experienced via a lot of magical thinking by some public officials in the West. And they're not appreciating that there's quite a bit of radical danger emanating from the guy who is currently there. So I think in that balance, what if it's worse after Putin? We're underestimating Putin's danger and possibly overestimating the danger of what might come, relatively speaking. So if that's a kind of worry we have, we obviously should not be surprised by the historic center of Odessa getting bombed. And, I have fond memories of Odessa from many years ago. I stayed there for a week, so I'm not being sort of facetious. It's genuinely humanly and aesthetically confronting to see that stuff, but at the same time, we've got to say, is this a new pattern? And I don't believe it is. Now, what is Putin doing with his latest historical lecture that is exquisitely amateurish and exquisitely selective, and the assertion of a threat of Polish annexation of bits of Ukraine, followed on by this encounter with Lukashenko, in which Lukashenko was parroting the pre-prepared speech that the Wagner folks are putting a lot of pressure on him because they really want to go and invade Poland. And as one commentator helpfully put, his take on Lukashenko's speech is, well, Lukashenko probably is feeling pressure from Wagner, but not in that way. So we don't know if there is something practical, some kind of a provocation that may be connected with all of this speech, but we can certainly analyze it as an informational push, right? So Mr. Putin wants to freeze the war, or at least confine it into some kind of a form that lasts for a long time, long enough for the West to get exhausted, long enough for the West's support to Ukraine to significantly expire, and most importantly, and this is a kind of a dogma in the Kremlin, long enough for Western democracies to begin significantly wobbling and getting taken up with issues of domestic troubles, for them not to be able to sustain an effective foreign policy strategy toward Ukraine. So that means that once that happens, Putin may want to escalate, and I believe he does. I even believe he thinks he must, whether he wants to or not, given how he thinks about regime security. But for now, he doesn't want to escalate, right? And so therefore, this story that, Poland and Lithuania should be scared about a threat coming out of Belarus, and all of these stories about Poland annexing bits of Ukraine, they are partly aimed at consolidating the pro-peace party in the West, the party that says, okay, it's now time to negotiate. Mr. Putin understands that the West position is not pro-Ukrainian victory, it's pro-Ukrainian independence, survival, plus. Maybe they'll get something more, maybe they won't, but that's roughly the politics behind the support, the military and every other kind of support that Ukraine has got. The politics behind that is what I would call independence plus. Ukraine remains independent, survives, and plus maybe regains some territory, or it does even better than regaining just some. But the plus means everything else is closer to the sort of pillar of a bonus than to the pillar of a must. Putin understands that. But he also wants to chip away at the West's commitment to Ukraine's independence. Even if he thinks he can't chase that commitment out all the way, he thinks there are good prospects for weakening it. So that's the nature of this informational push. Please, guys, be worried about the globalization of the war. It's not a good idea. The longer it goes, the more risky it becomes. And then anyway, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is not working, and he spent a lot of time talking about that again. And his favorite, phrase is that Western machinery burns really well. So that's the informational pull. I'm not sure that I'm qualified to say what the precise intent is here in terms of intimidating Poland out of being a kind of a vocal leader on a hawkish stance toward Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. But it's not just about Poland, it's about this attempt to consolidate the pro-peace party. I think on this, Putin does have a connection with reality. What came out of that 12-minute talk that absolutely is disconnected from reality is appeal to Ukrainians to come to their senses, to realize that they're being used by NATO, to realize that Ukrainian civilians are being needlessly killed, needlessly drafted, to serve the purposes of not even just European interest, but American interest. And this is key for him too, that you've got to understand that Europe is a kind of a blind, insufficiently self-aware co-conspirator with the United States here. And if Europe only understood its proper interests properly, realized that this is not in Europe's interest, this is a kind of American war. And Mr. Putin said whether this is in America's interests is a question that's up to Americans, but he's quite certainly confident that it's not in the interests of Europeans. So I think here he is probably pretty effectively pushing some levers, pressing some buttons, but these appeals to Ukrainians are absurd and a reflection of that extraordinary freezing in time of his processing of Ukraine that we discussed in our anti-psychoanalytic sketch in one of the previous videos. This is a guy who really cannot, in any kind of three-dimensional and pliant way, visualize the Ukraine evolving beyond 2014, right? He wants to drag it back to before then. Anything else just doesn't register, doesn't make sense to him. That's a little bit of my 2 cents on all of that. Quick final remark about disagreement. There is a particular message I get very often that's so lovely and it makes me smile. So it's only for a very special purpose that I'm going to gently be ironic about that message. And that message is, really love this project so much, even if there may be a couple of things we don't fully agree on. And I just want to say something little, because I'll be saying so much more and so systematically more about this. It is a bit like, especially to a philosopher, like walking into a kitchen and telling the chef, you're a great chef, but I actually make my onion soup differently to you. Fantastic. Where is the but? Where is the but here? And it would be a kind of misanthropic nightmare in which everybody made onion soup the same way. So what am I really saying by this? I'm saying that we have a tendency in the way we engage with people who we don't disagree with radically, right? Who are in some way kind of on our side, but they're people we disagree with in some significant ways that aren't radical, right, on particular issues. And we focus on that disagreement. But I think what we should focus on more instead is whether we share concerns with people. So when you're engaging with people like this or like that, think more, not whether you agree or disagree, but whether you share a concern or several concerns with them, and that can be helpful. So let's, I suppose, take a quick example. Imagine that your position is that Ukraine's got to be helped to win this war, and that's going to happen by making Ukraine whole again, right? Imagine somebody comes along and says, well, I don't like that idea because that's going to cost a lot of Ukrainian lives. But then imagine they say that not because they really mean it, but because they are engaged in a local culture war in which it makes sense to say that. And here you might say, well, actually, they they say that they care for Ukrainian lives, but they don't actually share this concern with me. But then imagine somebody else who actually does feel worried about the war going on, because they feel that it's perhaps unwinnable for Ukraine, and they do genuinely care about Ukrainian lives, and they're not pushing an American culture war agenda on one side or another. Well, you do share a concern with them. You have a different view, but you share a concern with them. Right? You're both sitting there saying, Ukraine matters, Ukrainian lives matter, Ukraine's independence matters, Ukraine's wholeness matters, but you express that concern by arriving at different views, right? So that's very, very important, to recognize not shared views, but shared concerns. What it allows you also, of course, to do is to realize that your opponents on one issue could be your allies on another, right? Or even that your opponents on an issue share enough of what you care about that you can call yourselves allies too for some purposes, right? So that's really, really important as we struggle through being in an environment and being victim of a psychology that perpetually tilts us toward the kind of polarization that's incompatible with the sustenance of any kind of a common project that all citizens of a single country have. This is a rant, so I'm going to stop it here. Let's talk soon.